Hey guys, welcome back. So getting into more Justice League and our talks about the 6 different dimensions to where at this point they have entered into the 6th dimension, what I wanted to do in this video to illustrate the depth of what's going on here is talk for a bit about all 6 dimensions and how they relate to one another in addition to what exactly the 6th dimension is and what the Justice League found there. So let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week. And don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so previously on this playlist, prior to the Justice League entering into the 6th dimension, we had seen them seeking counsel from Mxyzptlk to also give them access to the 6th dimension in order to stop Lex Luthor. And once again, much of the information that they've got prior to this point had came from Martian Manhunter, who had recently reached out to Lex Luthor and sharing with Luthor the hidden truths from his childhood, which Martian Manhunter had learned from the Elder Keith. And with all the information that Martian Manhunter had collected to this point, when this was put together with Starman's connection to the totality, this eventually led to them bringing in Mxyzptlk, who's from the 5th dimension, and as he explains, for some time he has seen this event coming, almost like an inevitable fate, and because of this, in slightly of a retcon type fashion, he explains that all the instances where he's ran into with Superman, they have all been for the purpose of him instilling 5th dimensional energy within Superman for such a time as this, which makes sense for both Superman and Lois Lane both merging with their new 52 counterparts. And the Lois part, it'll make sense later on, but we'll get to that. But with further explaining all of this to the Justice League, Mxyzptlk shows them pretty much the map of the multiverse as they know it. And he's doing this to find a way to get them to understand how the different dimensions work together and kind of build on top of each other, because the multiverse itself, which exists within the 3rd dimension, and the dark multiverse being pretty much the other side of that coin, so to speak, both of these are really 2 sides of one coin in only one dimension. Because if you start with just the 1st dimension, it's only a dot, 1 point, literally one dimensional, 1 dot, 1 point, that's it. And the 2nd dimension is if you were to take multiple points and create a line in between them, that line in between those points will be your 2nd dimension. But your 2nd dimension builds off of your 1st dimension because of these lines, they need a place to stop and start so that they can produce multiple lines which start and stop and create pretty much everything that lives in your 2D dimension. Because in your 2D dimension, which for us is like every illustration ever, your lines which go from point to point can only go along your X or Y axis. And within this 2D dimension, you have 360 degrees where you can draw any of these lines at a number of distances with infinite combinations to make whatever shape, but only in 2D because it's your 2nd dimension. But getting into the 3rd dimension, when you take your X and Y axis and add a Z, which is depth, you're no longer limited than just up, down, left, and right like on a sheet of paper. But now you have depth, which is your perspective view, which is what makes the 3rd dimension the dimension that we live in, or like your live action, because now you're no longer restricted to just your X or Y axis, because now the 3rd dimension has granted you depth, which is the reality that we live in, a 3-dimensional reality. So now for the case of the story, just so I don't lose anybody, as far as the characters in the narrative, they live in the 3rd dimension. But you and I know that we're reading the comic book and it's 2D, but just stay with me. For the case of the story, they live in the 3rd dimension. Because as far as they're concerned, this is the real world to them, even though it's being delivered to us in a 2D format. And so now after that, you have your 4th dimension. And your 4th dimension is time, which once again builds on top of the dimensions which lay beneath it. Because the simplest explanation of time is the relation of 3-dimensional objects one to another, whether it's the Earth revolving and making days, or making its revolutions around the sun to where each complete cycle becomes a year. But without these 3-dimensional objects having a relation to one another, there would be no time. Because time needs 3rd-dimensional constructs, the 3rd dimension needs 2-dimensional lines, and what good is one infinite line if it doesn't start and stop at 2 particular points? And once again, all these things have to build up together to work up to your 4th dimension. And so now for your 5th dimension, which is where it gets crazy again, your 5th dimension is imagination, which as Einstein would say is much more important than knowledge, because it's here in the 5th dimension where all the ideas and possibilities flow between all the other realms. Because what is imagination without information are the points and lines and other axes which together can build infinite possibilities. But on the top of all of this is where you have your 6th dimension, which Mxyzptlk describes as the control room for everything, and with it being the realm, if you will, beyond imagination, is also known as the realm of the impossible. And as far as Mxyzptlk knows, the only ones to have operated there is Perpetua and her 3 children, the Monitor, the Anti-Monitor, and the World Forger. And any time that any of them will be destroyed, it is likely that in that 6th dimension, in that penthouse of everything that exists, that's where they would reform, then likely head on about to wherever they'd like to go. But bringing all of this back in, now that you guys know what all the 6 dimensions are, and why Superman was chosen to be the first one to pass through, and even with doing so, this leading to an not so expected outcome, with us finding him there deserted in the worst of circumstances imaginable, which also seem impossible to escape, which begins to show us the duality of the 6th dimension, which is your realm of the impossible, but whether it's impossibly good or impossibly bad just depends on who you're dealing with. And so now for the rest of the Justice League who was invited in shortly after and given their invitation in their way of passage by this future Superman who takes them all to the Hall of Justice and what it could be, with the intention of showing them the world and what it one day will be, with the heroes becoming victorious and Gotham more or less becoming like Metropolis, becoming much brighter and flourishing pretty much into the possibility of what Gotham would become had Batman's work finally been finished, which in this reality cost him his life, but Dick Grayson had stepped up and taken his place. And as far as Kendra and John, who also have a child together in this future, they work together operating these hubs which unite multiple planets, with John acting as a shepherd to unite the different minds, and Kendra who's like your messenger bird, but she also helps John to know what to share and what to conceal to avoid conflicts and sustain peace. And as far as like your future Flash here, which is like one of your most trippiest outcomes, because at this point he's figured out a way to use the speed and the still force to collapse hypertime and obtain like god level access to the time stream without any unpredictable variables or repercussions, which not only allow him to tap into others throughout time, but also with the assistance of the Lanterns who know a thing or two about constructs, they're able to use these new forces with a bit of help of accessing the brilliance of other minds throughout the course of time, but ultimately rebuilding the multiverse from what's been destroyed in the Great War with these new forces and bringing it back, making it better and bigger. And as far as Diana, she discovers that she remodeled Themyscira with the help of Vixen, Kara, and Poison Ivy to, rather than be a secret from the world, to actually become a light to where the magic that was hidden here could be used instead to help the others when needed. And so now here in the 6th dimension, what this future Superman is proposing to the Justice League is that with the Source Wall being destroyed and Luthor raising a cosmic goddess, better known as the Super Celestial Perpetua, but with the Source Wall being destroyed and the multiverse drifting towards the void, rather than stop it, he suggests that they speed this process up, because the way things were intended to be, these broken multiverses that would drift back, they would be then judged by the brothers of Perpetua. But her plan was to modify this multiverse and actually make it a weapon to use against her brothers. And so at this point in time, with Mxyzptlk pretty much losing it and only Mira, Jarro, and Starman left at the Hall of Justice to deal with them, Lex Luthor and Brainiac, who are aware of this, they also make the plans of their own to snatch another imp that would side with them, revealing their plans of using Batmite to work with the Legion of Doom. But it comes to a point back in the 6th dimension when Shane, the future son of John and Kendra, seeks out the original John and Kendra, telling them that there's a terrible secret that he needs to show them. And this is pretty huge because prior to this point, the only person really with suspicions had been Batman. But over the course of time with him talking to Dick Grayson and him reaching a level of understanding of not only how everything came about, but also how everything was functioning, with Barbara doing rehabilitation, Damian doing global patrol, and Dick Grayson standing in Batman's place, like it lined up things to the point of where speeding up the arrival of this multiverse to the shores of judgment, like it made sense. Because if it's judged being perfect, it'll be allowed to continued imperfection, rather than being seen flawed and destroyed because of that. But while having to sit down with Dick Grayson, Martian Manhunter reaches out to Bruce, telling him they need to meet up immediately so he can tell him these new discoveries. And so at this time, the original Superman, who had been trapped in this isolated area that's pretty much unnamed but out of reach for anyone to actually get to him, during this time he's completely been out of the loop from what's been going on with Mxyzptlk back on Earth in the 3rd dimension, as well as everything that's been going on with the rest of the Justice League in the 6th dimension. But while he's here on this dark, isolated planet, repeatedly trying to make his escape, he's approached by the future Superman, who is actually the reason why he's here, and what we will find out is actually a pocket universe concealed within the 6th dimension. But future Superman tells the original Superman that he's come here just to ask him a question, and in doing so soliciting that the original Superman chooses a side. And initially we don't get the proposal that was given to Clark, not in its entirety, but rather we just get his answer, which is a no. And when he tries to fight against this future Superman, who stops his punch with a single finger, like nothing Clark does to him affects him in the slightest. But when he hits Clark back, it's the polar opposite, like it shakes the whole planet. But all in all, with him turning down this future Superman's proposal and refusing to do what is asked of him, the future Superman just leaves him there with his powers fading. But there's food nearby, like there's a garden nearby if he would just give up and stay. But he tells Clark if he continues to make his attempts to leave, he'll eventually die in space and just drift right back here like every other Superman that's come before him. But as far as the other original members of the Justice League, when Shane has gathered them together to tell them and show them this truth, and at this point there's no time to explain, he just tries to tell them that they must side with him, because if they don't, he'll destroy them and he has their friend. And of course at that point they're completely confused because they don't know what friend they're talking about. They believe this to be Superman, and before Shane can say anything else, everyone is just frozen where they're at. And when this future Superman arrives, stopping Shane from giving them any further information, it's not necessarily because he wants to hide the truth any further, but on the contrary, it's because he would rather tell them himself. And at this point they've clearly figured out that he is not their Superman. And in his response, he tells them that he is actually the only Superman who can save them. And he assures them that their Superman, he's safe where he is, for the time being at least, and he only assumed this form to present himself to them so they wouldn't be initially intimidated. But when they tell him like, look, you already lied to us, like why should we believe anything else you say? It's then that he reveals himself to actually be the first son of Perpetua, the World Forger. And when he fully reveals himself here, it's here that we get the full proposal that he had given Superman, and more or less without him explaining the reason why he separated Superman from the rest of the Justice League. Because in the 6th dimension, this multiverse is actually his masterpiece, and his proposal is to have this multiverse replace the existing one, being that he sees it as perfect, being his masterpiece, of which he explains represents the symbol of justice. But in order for it to replace the existing multiverse, the Justice League have to carry this out, and do so by potentially removing everyone who would eventually rebel, of whom the World Forger already knows who that's gonna be. But his plan is that everyone is removed before they can act, and this way the universe would reach perfect justice, because it needs to do so before it washes up on the shore of judgment, which is how he would prefer it to arrive, rather than the way that Perpetua designed, with the unnatural forces designed to be used as a weapon. But rather, the World Forger would rather align it at how he deems perfect by realigning these forces and just removing everyone who doesn't agree. And the Justice League, like the way they see this, like this isn't justice, like just removing people, especially before they had done anything, like they know that this isn't what they would choose, neither would Superman, which is why the Forgers separated Superman from everyone else and made himself to appear like he was the only symbol of hope by taking on the appearance of Superman. And the World Forger tells them that they pretty much only have this option, like either remove those that rebel or everyone dies when the multiverse reaches the judges. And when he gets more specific about the ones being removed and what would happen to them, he lets them know that they wouldn't be killed, they would just be locked away. And the Justice League is like, okay, sure, they're locked away, and then after judgment we can let them free again, right? He's like, nope, they locked away forever. Like they doing life beyond life. And when they hear this, it's a unanimous no from everyone except for Batman. And although his answer isn't a definite yes, he's the only one here who doesn't give a definite no like the rest of the team. And it's because of this that the World Forger decides, with his judgment being save only the good or save no one, that he leaves with Batman and sends the rest of the Justice League to be imprisoned just like any of the other villains who existed in this reality, in this 6th dimensional version of Apokolips, which is where the World Forger would have everyone who doesn't agree with like his perfect utopia to be locked up forever. And with this version of Apokolips being run by Lois Lane. And so this right here, like this reveal had me thinking two things. One, in my first thought was like, why is Lois there? Or why did the World Forger choose Lois? Which is most likely like amongst the trillions that are locked up here, amongst them there's not one Superman. But also with everything that's going on with Mxyzptlk back on Earth in the 3rd dimension, we also got to keep in mind that he had made provision for both Superman and Lois, and more so for Superman. But with him merging both Superman and Lois with their new 52 counterparts, it's likely that this is part of the reason that he had made this provision for the both of them, knowing that the World Forger would choose Lois Lane to run this Apokolips on steroids in the 6th dimension. And as far as Batman, I don't care what nobody say, Batman made the right choice. And not after long we'll see what that got him, but as for now, I still gotta say Batman made the right choice. Because as far as at this point, he still has time before the Legion of Doom makes their attempts to acquire Batmite. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Plenty of madness going on, and as you know, I'm just here to try to make sense out of it all. But let me know your thoughts and predictions down in the comments, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.